All right, we're back. Graveyard Shift Movie Podcast, episode number 151, I do believe. I didn't check, so I might have fucked that up, but I don't think I did. Um, this week, boy, do I have a movie to talk to you guys about. I watched Blood Harvest from 1987. And the only reason I watched this movie is because Tiny Tim, famed musical actor, famed musical musician, Tiny Tim, is in this movie. And I thought that he was playing the main killer. But there might be some twists involved with that. But yeah, if you don't know Tiny Tim, he's the tiptoe through the tulip. Yeah, all that, the tiptoe through the tulips with me, the creepy song from Insidious, and he sang a whole bunch of SpongeBob songs and everything. So I'm sure you've heard a song from him at one point. But yeah, he was in this movie, and he's on the cover, and he's in this clown makeup, and he looks really creepy. So I was like, fuck me, I gotta watch this movie. And I'm gonna be honest, for a while, it was doing pretty good. It was weird. Tiny Tim is by far the best part of the movie, at least in my opinion. Anytime he was on screen, his character was just so unsettling and, mysterious. You were kind of trying to figure out what was going on with him. And he was by far my favorite part. And then it seems like about halfway through, he just stops kind of showing up. And that's when the movie kind of declined. I'm going to give it a 5.5, I think. I was thinking, like I said earlier on in the movie, I was going straight like 7, 6.5. But yeah, 5.5 seems to where I think I landed by the end of it. It's a fun, well, it's not really fun, but it's a sleazy, late 80s slasher. There is a lot of sexual assault later on, which I wasn't really prepared for. So be prepared for that if you watch this movie. And there's also a mystery surrounding this movie where the main actress in the movie who plays Jill, the main character, after this movie just dropped off the face of the earth, disappeared. No one knows where the fuck she went. No one knows if she's alive, dead. Yeah, so they've been trying to find her for decades, and they haven't ever found her. So, that's pretty cool. But yeah, so hey, spoiler warning for Blood Harvest from 1987. I think they might have made a remake of it later on. It seemed like when I was looking this movie up, there was 2 different Blood Harvests. So I think it might have been in that time where like just everything was getting remade in like the late 2000s. So I don't know how that one is. Don't check that one out. Watch this one if you're going to watch it. But yeah, so spoiler warning for Blood Harvest from 1987. Gonna ruin everything about it. You've been warned. I was very curious because I know I've heard Tiny Tim talk, but I'm more used to his high voice singing, and so I was wondering how he was going to sound in this movie. And the movie opens up with him singing, and so I was very happy. Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water.
Gary and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Gary fell down and broke his crown. And Jill came tumbling after. Gary and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Gary fell down and broke his crown. And Jill came tumbling after.
He's singing. He's like crying as he's singing. And then we see a person being strung up upside down by a rope, it looks like. And then their throat being cut open and bled out. And then we see the bodies being loaded up into an ambulance. And we see another man watching the bodies load up into an ambulance. who will learn that his name is Gary later on. We then see a foreclosure auction, and this is the main opening plot of the movie. Is that the bank is foreclosing on all of these people's farms. It's a farm town. Everyone's a farmer, and the bank is cut, and they're foreclosing, and the farmers are losing their land. They're losing their houses, their livestock, all of that, and they're not rioting, but they're like causing like you know, where it's just a bunch of guys yelling in the crowd, and we see Tiny Tim as part of the farmers who are all yelling. So you're like, okay, maybe Tiny Tim is like a farmer who's lost his land and he's gonna start killing people, you know. But yeah, so we see that guy, or we see the foreclosure auction, and that's how the movie opens up. We then go to Tiny Tim at home, and he's watching the news as they're talking about everyone losing land, and he's sitting there and he's like, and he's rocking back and forth with his hands covering his mouth, you know, like that. After that, we then go over and we meet our main character, Jill, who her dad is the guy who, he's the lawyer representing the bank. He's not the bank itself, but he's the guy representing the bank, I believe. Anyway, so she's not well liked around the town either. And to illustrate that point, as she's talking to her friend at this diner, this redneck dude like walks past her and like and spits in the and spits in front of her, and she's like, ugh, you know. So she leaves and goes back home. And when she gets home, she sees that her house is covered in red paint that says like scum and get out and all this shit. And she's like, oh my God. And she's like, Mom, Dad, you know, and she opens up the door, and in front of her, hung by a noose, is, I guess, a dummy. Because at first I thought it was just a really gnarly, like they had burned the dad to death, and the face is all charcoal black with these red eyes. But the hands were like flesh-colored hands, and there was an arrow sticking out of its chest. But it ends up being just a fake dummy. And so she screams at first, but then she stops when she realizes what it is. And then she walks into the kitchen, and she sees Tiny Tim, who is in here, and he is now in full clown makeup, and his clown name is Marvelous Mervo. I believe his real name is Mervin in the movie. And he's like, oh, I brought you some flowers. He doesn't talk like that in the movie. He talks with a normal voice, but I'm just going to talk with it. He's like, oh, I got you Marvelous Mervo at your service. And he gives her some flowers and shit. He's kind of freaking her out. But in the middle of them talking, Gary, the guy that we saw watching the bodies get loaded up into the back of the ambulance, comes in. And he's like, oh, Mervin, what are you doing? You're scaring Jill, you know? This is when we find out that Gary and Mervin are brothers. And Mervin's not doing too good up in the head, and he's created this character, Mervo, to, I guess, escape in, you know. There's a line here I like where Jill is like, have you seen my dad? And he's like, I saw him yesterday. He even talked to me. He told me 3 things. Go to hell. And I was like, oh shit. And yeah, so he's like, listen, I don't know where he is. I'll see you later. And so him and Mervin peace out. She's chilling at home when she gets a phone call, and she goes and she answers the phone. And as soon as she picks up the phone, she doesn't even like say hello. Just on the other end, just fuck you, bitch. And then hangs up, and then a brick flies in through a window. And she's like, God damn. And then she looks, and we see someone moving around in this barn that she has outside in front of her. And so she goes outside, and I'm like, okay, she's going to go to the barn and investigate the barn. But as she does that, we see it's clearly Mervin who's in the barn, and he's like peeking out in clown makeup and shit, but she never sees him. And then she just goes walking into the woods, like running through, legit, there's not like a path or anything. She's just in the woods. And I was like, what the fuck are you doing here? The next thing you know, these camouflage ninjas start popping up, who all have they have these camouflage masks on and shit. And she's like, "Oh fuck, I'm being hunted right now." But if you look closely, you notice that all their guns have like the orange tip on the end of the barrel. So I thought they were airsoft players, but I don't know if airsoft had been invented in '87. But paintball sure had, because they shoot this bitch directly in the forehead with a paintball gun. And then they're like, "Oh shit, my bad." They're like, "What the fuck are you doing out here anyway?" And she was like, "I was walking to town." And the guys are like, "Walking to town? What the fuck are you talking about?" So the guy that shot her is like, "Well, hey, let me give you a ride in my truck to town." And so she's like, "Okay." So they go and load up into his sweet pickup truck that has a sweet ass Confederate flag front bumper tag. And he drives her into town and drops her off in front of the sheriff's office. And he goes, "Hey, how about I take you out sometime to make up for shooting you with the paintball?" And she's like, "Sorry, I'm engaged." And he goes, "Okay, well, how about some meaningless sex?" And she's like, "Ah," and she walks away. And he's like, "Well, I tried." And so she goes into the sheriff's office because she wants the sheriff to investigate or she wants to know if the sheriff knows where her mom and dad are. He's dressed up in a full, like, softball getup. And he even says, he's like, "Listen, I got a softball game in, like, 3 minutes." And she's like, "Fuck that. You got to come to my house because my house is fucking trashed and you got to see this place." And so he's like, "God damn it. Okay." So he goes to her house in full softball uniform, with the cop hat or sheriff hat and like the gun around his belt. It looked ridiculous. As they're on their way to the house, we go over to Tiny Tim, who has a fucking like hobbit home where it's just in the side of this hill and it's just like a cobblestone door that he opens up and goes inside. And as he goes inside, we see that there's a woman who's tied up in a chair. And I was like, "Oh, fuck, this must be the mom." And Tiny Tim's got this bitch kidnapped. The sheriff and Jill arrive at her house, but everything has been cleaned up. And she's like, "What the fuck? Someone's playing a trick on me." And the sheriff's like, "Yeah, you and me both. Listen, if I leave right now, I can still make it to the last inning of my game. So I'm peacing the fuck out." And he leaves. That's it. He's gone. We go back over to Tiny Tim, who now is inside of a church, and he's like on his knees at the front, and he's praise singing to God to make his soul pure, and he keeps going, "My parents, my parents." And so you're like, "Oh shit, what the fuck did he do to the parents?" You know? So at this point, I thought that Gary, Tiny Tim's brother, was the one who was engaged to Jill. But it's not. It ends up being like some guy she met when she went off to college named Scott, who, when he comes into the movie later on, is played by, I can't remember his fucking name, but I know him as Nate Fisher from 6 Feet Under, if any of you guys watch that show. He more recently has been in, like, what is it, Chicago Fire PD or something, where he's like a firefighter, I think on like an NBC show or something. But yeah, so I was like, holy shit, look at it. In 87, this is what this guy was doing. It must have been one of his first things. So Gary shows up at Jill's house, and he tells her, he's like, "Oh, I cleaned up the place while you were gone, so that's why the mess was all clear when the sheriff got back." And she's like, "You should have seen me trying to explain to the sheriff that someone had cleaned this mess up." And he's like, "That is a hoot." So then he's like, "Hey, let's go hang out in that old tree house that we built when we were younger." And she's like, "What? We're fucking 30. And he's like, "Come on, bitch." And so he grabs her hand and they go running. And sure enough, there's this old tree house that they built when they were kids. And they climb up in the tree house and they sit down and they're talking about like when they were younger and shit. And this is when we learn that at the beginning of the movie, when we saw those bodies being loaded up into the ambulance, and Gary watching them being loaded up. That was the parents, and the parents were murdered. But no one, they never found out who murdered the parents. This is also when I think he starts to like say, hey, you know, I'm in love with you, Jill. And she's like, ooh, actually, I'm engaged to another guy after I went off to college. And he's like, ah. He's just upset. So now he's all bummed out and sad and shit. And he's like, okay, I'll see you later, Jill. And he fucking leaves. We go back over Tiny Tim. He's still just playing music to himself. He's singing that song in the Jack and Jill up a hill. She gets home. And she gets into the shower. But then, like, someone turns up the water heat. So it just, like, starts boiling her. And she's like, ah, God. And she gets out. And she goes into the kitchen. And the sink randomly turns on. And she's like, what the fuck is going on? And then we see Tiny Tim outside of her house, like, lurking around, you know? And then he just comes inside. He's just like, hey, it's me, Tiny Tim. He then offers, because she was going to make herself some coffee, so he offers to make them both coffee. But this is, I swear to God, this is how he says it. Well, why don't I make us both coffee, and then you have nothing to worry about? And I was like, that's the most menacing fucking let me make us coffee I've ever heard. And apparently she did not think it was as worrisome as I did, because she's like, sure, that sounds great. So I thought for sure that he was going to, like, poison the coffee and knock her out. But instead, he just, like, tells her a joke, and they both laugh, but then he keeps getting closer and closer, and he's like, ho, 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 you know? And she's like, ugh, I don't like this. And he's like, oh, sorry, gotta go, bitch. And he fucking, and he leaves, and that's it. That's the end of that whole scene. We then get a shot of the chair that we saw the lady tied up in earlier, and the chair is empty now. So we presume that the mom has been killed at this point. Jill then wakes up, or no, she's reading a book later that night, and she hears like this screeching, like squeaky noise. And she looks outside, and she sees someone sitting on a swing outside of her house in the middle of the night. So she calls the sheriff again. She interrupts him once again. He was like about to go to a poker game, and he's like, fucking, I guess I'm done with poker tonight. And so he calls her to come over. He's like, there's a fucking, or she's like, there's a dude on a swing. Get your ass over here. So he's like, okay. As she's waiting for the sheriff, her fiance Scott, who's played by Nate Fisher, calls, and she's talking to him, and she's like, I just called the cops. There's some guy on a swing, and it's squeaking and shit. But as she's talking to him, she hears the squeaking stop, and she's like, oh God. And then she hears someone on the porch, and she's like, oh God. But it ends up being the sheriff who showed up. And as he opens up the door, he also brings in Tiny Tim with him and says that this was your prowler. You know, he was the one sneaking around. And she's like, gosh. And he's like, sorry, I just didn't want anyone hurting you, so I was staying outside. And so she's like, okay, just take him home. And so the sheriff does. He takes Tiny Tim home. Later that night, this bitch falls asleep on her bed, which I guess is where you fall asleep. But she sleeps with the windows open and shit. So a dude just sneaks into her house. And then he uses fucking instant chloroform where she's asleep, but he takes a rag and goes, and puts it over her face. And this is how it goes. It goes, oh, and that's it. That's as fast. She was out. She woke up for half a second and was out again. So he puts her ass out, and then he proceeds to rip her shirt open, exposing the titties, the tatas, and then he ties up her hands and feet and strips off the rest of her clothes and leaves her all naked and shit, and takes photographs of her. And I assume this was to, like, blackmail her, because I assume this was going to be, like, a farmer who's going to blackmail the dad and say, you know, if you don't give us our land back, look at what your daughter is doing, you know. Um, but he takes all the photos and then he unties her and he leaves. And then after that, we see him at his wherever he's staying, and he's putting the Polaroids up on the wall. And we see that in the Polaroids, the lady is wearing a bra in the pictures. And so I was wondering, because the Polaroids they took were like of each section of her body. And before it was like very clearly like he was just taking full body photos. And so he's making a collage on the wall to print out her whole body. So did they have to retake those photos after the movie was done or something? And the lady like refused to be nude again, and so she like kept the bra on. Yeah, I don't know. It was so weird that she had the bra on in those photos, but you know, whatever. Um, so the next morning, Jill is still fucking passed out from chloroform. And her fiance Scott shows up, and he's like, "Hey, what's up, Jill?" And she's like, "Oh, I was sleeping." And then they're like, "Hey, let's run through the living room." And then they get in the living room, and then they're like, "Hey, let's fuck on the ground." And that's where they start fucking on the ground. And by fucking, I mean, she gets naked and lays on the ground, and Nate Fisher takes his shirt off, and then like sucks her titties some, and kisses her. And Gary shows up and is like peeking through the window, and he's like, "Ooh," you know. And then they get a phone call and they stop. And that scene went on for 7 minutes, it seemed like. Let me see here. So, eventually, she's talking about how her parents are still gone. She doesn't know where they are. And so Scott is like, well, hey, how about I go talk to the sheriff? I'll get some fucking answers out of him, you know? And she's like, yeah, if you can't do it, no one can. So he's like, cool, I'll see you later. So he leaves and he gets in his car to drive off and go to the sheriff. But as he starts to leave, he sees what looked like one of those paintball guys running through the field and into the barn. And so he gets out to go follow the guy. And as he walks into the barn, he just gets a fucking baseball bat straight to the dome. And then he gets dragged into the barn. And we'll see him later, and he's all strung up upside down. As he gets dragged into the barn, though, Gary just so happens to show up right after that happens. And he's like, hey, what's going on? You know, you haven't been fucking any other guys in here, have you? Also, I noticed that at this point, this lady had been in just panties and a shirt for about 30 minutes of the movie. She would proceed to be in just panties and a shirt for, I think, over 75% of the movie until the last act where she finally puts on some clothes. So Tiny Tim shows up again. He peeks in through the window and Jill sees him and it scares him. So Gary goes out and grabs Tiny Tim and brings him inside, and he's like, you fucking apologize. You scared her again, you know? And so he's like, I'm sorry. You know, I just wish your dad wouldn't have done that stuff to our parents. And I was like, oh shit, is there going to be like a twist where the dad fucking murdered the, Tiny Tim and them parents? But Gary's like, shut up. And he like drags them away, and, they leave. As they leave, though, Jill's friend, who we met in that one scene at the diner earlier when she got spat at by that guy, shows up. And she's like, hey, I'm going to hang out with you. And they're like, cool. And then they go up to their bedroom, and it goes daytime to nighttime. And then the lady goes, all right, I'm going to leave now. And that's it. It was just to get her into the scene so then she could leave and go outside to her car, and all the doors would be locked. And then she could look over and see a guy in all camo wearing a stocking over his face, who is clearly Gary. Like, I don't know if you still weren't supposed to recognize him, but I was like, oh, that's Gary. I guess he's the killer. And not Gary chases her into the barn, and shoots her hand with a fucking arrow and sticks it into like a wood beam. And then he goes over to her and drags her over to a rope, strings her up upside down, gets her naked and shit, and then cuts her fucking throat and she is dead. So that's all she came back for, was just so we could have another kill, because it had been quite a bit since we had seen anyone die. Right after that happens, Gary shows up at the house again. And Gary's like, listen, everyone seems to be disappearing and shit. How about you come stay at my place? You'll be safe there. And she's like, no, I'm okay here, you know. So he's like, okay. So he leaves, and she like cries to herself after he leaves. This is when we go into the barn and we see that the fiance dude is still alive, but he's strung upside down. Jill falls asleep on the couch and then gets fucking instant chloroformed again. And once again, they show like the guy's shoes, and it's the same shoes that Gary has been wearing the whole movie. And I was like, we're supposed to know by now, right? That Gary is the killer. And then he picks her up, and there's a scene where he's carrying her out to the barn. And she's supposed to be like chloroformed and fucking out, but she has her hand around his neck to hold on to as they're walking. And I just thought it was funny that you could clearly see her holding on. He takes her inside to the barn and lays her down in front of the fiance, who is awake, and he's like wiggling around because he sees her and shit. And I don't know if he was planning on killing her here, or if he was going to kill the fiance and let the blood drip onto her. But either way, the police show up, or he hears the siren of the sheriff coming. So he throws her over his shoulder and walks her back to the house, and just has the biggest handful of ass you could ever have walking back to the house. And then, he puts her in, and he fucking, he leaves. He gets out of there. Sheriff's there. He walks around, doesn't see anything weird, so he leaves. And then we go back into the barn, where we see the dude strung up, and the fiance gets his neck cut and his blood drained into a bucket. Meanwhile, Tiny Tim is looking at pictures of pigs who have been slaughtered. And they had mentioned something about like their animals being slaughtered, and this pig underneath it writes Beulah or whatever. Jill eventually wakes up off of the couch, and she goes walking over to the fridge, and she opens it up, and real prankster move here. Presumably, well, not presumably, I mean, Gary had tied a string on the bucket of the blood to the door handle, and so when she pulls it open, the blood comes out and soaks all over her, and she falls to the ground. And once again, Gary just shows up, and he goes over and grabs her, and he's like, oh my god, Jill, my love, you're okay, and then he takes her into the shower and cradles her and is like kissing her cheek and gets her naked, and he's like, I love you, you're safe now, I love you. And then, she fucking, I guess, is still passed out from the chloroform or something. She's passed out again, because Gary comes and drops, and she's completely naked at this point, and drops her onto the couch. He starts sucking on the titties. And then he covers her up with a blanket, and I'm like, okay, he's gonna leave. But no, he just goes and sits in a rocking chair, and he stares at her, and he's like, just open mouth. And then he starts taking off his shirt, and the camera moves over to the girl, and just coming into frame is just Gary's ass, just naked ass coming, and he's gotten naked, and he crawls up on top of her, and goes to try to fuck her. But she wakes up and sees that it's him, and she's like, what the fuck are you doing? And he's like, I'm sorry, I love you, I'm just trying to, she's like, listen, I love you like a brother, I don't want to do this or whatever. And so he's like, oh, okay, So she gets up and like walks upstairs, and he leaves. We go over to Tiny Tim, who is staring at himself in the mirror, and he's washing the makeup off of his face finally, and he's like, I gotta do this, I have to do this, and then we cut to Gary, who's in the barn, and he's just he's crying, he's all sad and shit. So Tiny Tim shows up to Jill's house and asks her to come with him. And he says he has to show her this. She clearly is like creeped out by him and she doesn't want to come, but he just kind of pulls her by the arm, and so she follows him. He takes her to his house and reads her a letter that their mother had written to them, and the letter reveals the big twist in the movie that the parents were not murdered. In fact, they committed suicide because they were losing their farm and everything, and the dad didn't want to go on living, and the mom couldn't live without him, so they agreed to both kill themselves, and they're saying, we're sorry it had to be this way. And yeah, so they killed themselves, and Gary knew that would be bad for the family's reputation, so he removed everything that made it look like a suicide, and I think even like cut their throats and stuff for extra measure and made it look like a murder, so that way it wouldn't be like a shameful like, ooh, those people, their parents killed themselves or whatever, you know. He also shows her the photos that someone took of her where she's all naked and shit. He says that Gary said that if I ever told anyone, he would throw me into a home and shit. And right as that happens, Gary shows up. And so Tiny Tim grabs Jill and holds her, and he's like, oh, I didn't tell her anything, Gary. She was snooping, I swear, you know? And so then fucking Gary comes over and starts fighting Tiny Tim. And I was like, who's supposed to be the good guy and bad guy here? Because I was like, all right, so the twist is that Tiny Tim was the good guy the whole time when you thought he was the bad guy. But then he's like making it seem like he was going to kill Jill because she knew too much. But they fight for a while until eventually Jill gets a gun from the table that's in the kitchen and fucking shoots Tiny Tim. And I was like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, I thought this was going to be like, oh, okay, Tiny Tim's the good guy. So she shoots Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim falls over. Gary then comes over to her and starts confessing his love to her and says that her parents and Scott and her friend are gone now and it's only them. And they're going to get married and shit. And she starts to play along, and she's like, yeah, okay, let me go home and pack my bags, and I'll meet you in front of the police station, and we can meet up and leave, you know? But then she, like, is looking at him, and I guess realizes that by her parents are gone, he means that he's murdered them. So she goes running. She freaks out, and she goes running away. Gary chases after her. She eventually makes it back to her home, and she tries to call the police, but before she can do that, Gary shows up, and somehow he has had time to change into his killer clothes, which has all the camouflage shit and the stocking over his head, or stocking pantyhose, whatever you want to call it. He chases her into the barn, where classic Final Girl circuit, where she sees all the dead people strung up. She sees her parents dead, her fiance dead, I think there was another guy in here that was dead too, and her friend that's dead. So once again, he's like, all right, I gotta finish the job now. He's gonna kill her, but she starts to like try to sweet talk him, and it's like, listen, we can leave, and it'll make it seem like Mervyn killed everyone, and they'll think that he killed us too, and they'll never find us and shit. And it's clearly working on this dude, because that's all he wants is her love. But then, in the middle of her doing that, she just turns to run, but she turns towards the back of the barn where it's just a wall. There's literally nowhere she could go. I was like, what the fuck are you doing? So she falls over. He gets on top of her, and they start fighting. She eventually picks up this fucking hay spike thing and stabs him into the arm. And she's able to get out of the barn and go running away again. He gets his knife and goes following after her. They wind up in this weird abandoned fucking house or barn area. I think it might be like where they kept the livestock. on Gary and them's farm. And she goes into this one sec. Well, first off, she's just sitting there, and Gary just walks up to her, and he's like, "Hey," and she's like, "Ah, shit." And so she goes into this other room, and blood starts dripping on her forehead, and she looks up, and there's a dead pig. The blood is raining down onto it, and so I don't know if that's supposed to be Beulah, who we mentioned, because there's a whole thing where I think it might be right here where Gary starts talking about how he lost everyone and all he had was Mervyn, but then, they slaughtered the livestock, and the livestock were Mervyn's friends, and especially Beulah. It would follow him around like a puppy, and all this shit, and so he like secluded into his clown character. But yeah, so he's like, "All right, I'm gonna kill you now," and they start fighting again. It looks like he might be trying to rape her again. But eventually, she gets the knife and she's trying to like stab him, and then he just like karate chops her in the side of the neck and knocks her out. He drags her back to the barn. He ties her up, and he's like, "Oh, I almost forgot to say bye. Goodbye, Jill." And I was like, "What? Okay." And he goes to stab her, but he gets fucking shot right here, mind you. Okay, so that's like a little under the shoulder. All right, and gets shot. And so they pan over, and I was thinking it was going to be the paintball gun guy. I kept waiting for him to make a comeback, but no. Instead, it is Tiny Tim, who is still alive, and he shot his brother. And he's like, "I'm sorry, I had to," And he goes over and he unties fucking Jill, and they go walking out of the barn, and we pan over to Gary's body, and this synth piano music is playing, and this is Thomas's live reaction, the voice to text. Okay, he's bleeding from the mouth, and they zoom in on him, and I'm assuming that the eyes are about to open up. I'm waiting. Hold on. Here we go. Here it comes. Oh, there it goes. It happened. And so I kind of called that, which makes sense because where he was shot was not a fatal looking wound. And then, yeah, he opens up his eyes, and that is the end of Blood Harvest. I couldn't find a budget in box office. I don't know if this one, it's not rated, so I don't even know. You can watch it on Tubi for free. That's where I watched it. I think it might be on Prime too. But so I don't have the box office or anything. So let's do best of, worst of. My best of is going to be Tiny Tim's performance. I loved him in this movie. I thought he was really good. He was such a weird character. I wish we got to see more of him. Yeah, and so Tiny Tim is my favorite part of the movie. Worst of is going to be when Scott and the girl were like fucking on the ground, because it goes for so long, and it's just like the cheesy 80s love music with like weird caresses, and like apparently the guy who played Scott didn't want to take off his jeans during it, so he's just like wearing clothes the whole. It's very weird. Yeah, so that's my worst of. But there you go. That is the end of Blood Harvest. Next week, once again, I have no idea what. Like I said, I gotta get a list going. But yeah, I have no idea what we're gonna watch next week. Maybe, I don't know. I haven't watched the Nope yet, even though I don't think it's necessarily a horror movie. But it is Jordan Peele, and the last two movies he made were, so maybe this one's horror adjacent. I'm not sure. But yeah, so maybe I'll check out Nope. But I'm not 100%. I'll find something to watch. But yeah, I really need to add up and get another list going. But besides that, that's basically all I got. Hey, by the way, can I just talk about real fast? If you're into comic books, and like sci-fi fucking things or whatever, go check out Saga if you haven't. I'm late to the game on this because I think these started in 2012, I believe. Um, and I had the first book. It's by Image Comics, which is the same comics that did The Walking Dead, and a book called Outcast, and a whole bunch. I read Rednecks, Moonshine. I think there's all from there. A bunch of other shit. But yeah, I had book one of Saga like in my Amazon cart for legit no shit like years. I'm talking like probably 2018. I probably had that book because I was like, eventually I'll read, and I just kept reading other shit and never got around to it. And then I read it, and it fucking hooked me like no story has done in a long ass time. And then book three ends on a super cliffhanger, kinda. And I was lucky enough that I just started reading it, so I was able to go out and get the next like 6 issues or whatever. But it went on hiatus after that cliffhanger happened from 2018 to 2022. So people who were reading that book from the start had to wait 4 years for the story to start again. So that sucks on it. But yeah, go check that out if you want something cool and fucking sad and funny to read. That's what I've been reading. Also, this is now book club. This is, if this book exists, you're in the wrong universe. This is weird sci-fi comedy mystery thing. It's pretty good so far. So check that out too, I guess. Also, did you guys hear the Safdie brothers, who made hits like Good Times and Uncut Gems, great movies? Their next movie with Adam Sandler, it's not going to be both of them directing it. I think both of them wrote it, but only one of them is going to direct it. I think the guy who's directing it is also the guy who plays the special brother in Good Time. I think he's the only one that's directing it. So I'm kind of worried about that movie now that it's I'm also worried about Deadpool 3, where if you see they can film it, but due to the writer's strike, like they're not allowed to improv or change anything that's been written. So everything that's been written has to be acted just how the script says. And so it better be a very good script. Either that or more likely they'll just do reshoots whenever the writer's strike ends, whenever that is. But yeah, so anyway, thanks for Mortal Kombat 1, September. Very excited. Speaking of Mortal Kombat and games, go check out the gaming channel. Me and Maverick just put out a Dead Island Riptide video, 30 minutes long, so go grab some popcorn and watch that. It was fun playing through that again. We just started playing that new Saints Row game, and it's not great, but it is what it is. So stuff is coming out there, and yeah, all right. I will see you guys next week for whatever I end up conjuring up, and I hope you'll be there. So, bye-bye.